the battlefields with my parents. I came back in 1966 as a college student doing the same thing. I never thought that I would become so intimately associated with this part of the country that proved to be the case a few years later. In 1981, when I came to work for the United States Army Command and General Staff College and was told to select a battlefield to educate America's mid-career professional officers, that I would have the chance to spend weeks at a time in the Chattanooga area. But from 1983 to 2009, I led a series of what the Army called staff rides to this area every year. I won't say that, unlike what was said of Waterloo, that battle was won by the British Army on the playing fields of Eton. I won't say that America's victories in the 20th and 21st century were won at Chickamauga and Chattanooga, but I know that we educated America's officers in their profession right here in this area. So I've been associated with Chickamauga and Chattanooga for a long time. And this is a great opportunity for me to come back and chair this panel for the Tennessee Sesquicentennial Commission on the battles for Chattanooga. Today we're going to proceed in the following fashion. I'm going to give a very brief summary overview of the events. I'm going to mention three themes that you might consider as you listen to what's being spoken here. And then I'm going to introduce our three most distinguished speakers, who will each share with you a few of their thoughts on the campaigns and battles for Chattanooga and the results. And then we will proceed to a discussion of significant events in that period. So without further ado, let me just give you a brief summary of the campaign to refresh your memory. Following the Tullahoma campaign, which gained Middle Tennessee for the Union in the summer of 1863, Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee withdrew behind the Tennessee River and centered their position on Chattanooga. Chattanooga then was a town of about 2,500 people, about the same size as the county seat of Adams County, Pennsylvania, a little place called Gettysburg. Chattanooga was a railroad center, a resource center for Confederate war material, copper and niter and iron and coal. Chattanooga also stood astride a pathway from Middle Tennessee into the munitions belt in the heart of the Deep South. Chattanooga was a place of great importance to both sides. But it took a while for the war to reach Chattanooga in 1863. The Federal Army of the Cumberland under William Rosecrans followed slowly from its base around Tullahoma, rebuilding the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and stockpiling supplies. Eventually, it would move again, and it crossed the Cumberland Plateau into the Tennessee River Valley on the 16th through 20th of August, 1863. Braxton Bragg now sought reinforcements from Joseph Johnston's little army in Mississippi, and ultimately he received 8 brigades. But he felt that even with that reinforcement, he couldn't hold the long line of the Tennessee River, and thus he had to wait for William Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland to commit themselves. Which way would they go? South of Chattanooga? North of Chattanooga? Or toward the city itself? Rosecrans and the Federal Army fainted north of Chattanooga. They bombarded the city beginning on the 21st of August. They continued off and on for several weeks. Some of the shells, which came from across the river, reached as far as the place we're sitting right now. Braxton Bragg had to move his headquarters away from downtown and out to beyond what is now Main Street. The city became virtually a ghost town. Having threatened the city directly and to the north, Rosecrans then crossed the Tennessee River at 4 separated places, the farthest south being Caverton's Ferry near Stevenson, Alabama. His columns drove into the mountains south of Chattanooga, threatening Bragg's rail line of communication to Atlanta. And on the 8th of September, Bragg withdrew from Chattanooga, and federal forces entered from 2 directions on the next day. The bulk of the Federal Army did not enter the city, but pursued into the mountains south of Chattanooga in a very dispersed manner. Braxton Bragg and the Confederate Army remained concentrated, however, and was going to receive another reinforcement from the Army of Northern Virginia. 5 brigades would ultimately show up on the battlefield of Chickamauga, and 4 more shortly thereafter. Bragg remained concentrated, and after 2 abortive attempts to destroy the Federal Army piecemeal, he finally brought the Army of the Cumberland to battle in the dense thickets of Chickamauga. The result was a 2-day battle which cost a total of 34,000 casualties, both sides together, Americans all, in that dark and bloody woods. On the second day of the battle, Rosecrans and 2 corps commanders were driven from the field. The Federal Army withdrew over a 2-day period into Chattanooga, and Bragg began to besiege the city. Supplies in Chattanooga got very tight for the Federal Army, but the Union quickly moved to reinforce its beleaguered Army of the Cumberland, sending 2 Army corps from the Army of the Potomac and several divisions from the Army of the Tennessee out in Mississippi. In late October, a couple of developments occurred which made a lot of difference. William Rosecrans, commander of the Federal forces, was relieved of command, and a new commander arrived on the scene shortly thereafter, Ulysses S. Grant, and he would be the man in charge henceforth if Chattanooga were to be relieved. In late October, Union forces under Joseph Hooker seized Lookout Valley and opened the supply line to Chattanooga, south of the Tennessee River. Confederate Commander James Longstreet, whose sector this was, failed to prevent the Federals from opening the supply line. Meanwhile, on Missionary Ridge at Bragg's headquarters, serious command turmoil had been taking place. Bragg relieved Leonidas Polk, Daniel Harvey Hill, Thomas C. Hindman, and reorganized his army. And following his failure at Lookout Valley, Longstreet was sent to confront the Federal Army under Andros Burnside, defending Knoxville. So Longstreet will leave the scene. Thus, as the Federals reinforce, the Confederates reduced their forces. And in late November, U.S. Grant will strike. On the 23rd of November, the Confederate picket line at Orchard Knob, outside the city then, inside the city now, was seized by federal forces. On the 24th of November, Joseph Hooker's command drives the Confederates from the slopes of Lookout Mountain in the famous Battle Above the Clouds. And on the 25th of November, a massive federal attack occurs against the Confederate positions on Missionary Ridge. William T. Sherman attacked the north end of the ridge and was held up at Tunnel Hill. Joseph Hooker was to attack the south end of the ridge, but he was delayed by a destroyed bridge over Chattanooga Creek. Thus it was left to the discredited Army of the Cumberland to attack and break the center of the Confederate line on Missionary Ridge. They did so, and the Confederates were routed. A slow pursuit began, but ended quickly at the Ringgold Gap when Confederates denied that passage to advancing Federals. And the armies drew back apart to await for the passage of the winter. Chattanooga remained in Federal hands and would remain so for the remainder of the war. And it would become a giant base for William T. Sherman's campaign into Georgia in the spring of 1864. Chattanooga was the gateway to ending the war. And by the end of November, the gateway was open. That, in very brief summary, are the events that we're going to talk about in piecemeal terms for the next hour and a half. I'd like to give you 3 organizing principles for you to think about as you listen, or as you later go out and visit or revisit, for most of you, the places associated with this campaign. The first organizing theme is the role of the peculiar terrain here. The course of the river, the width and depth of the river, the mountains, Walden's Ridge, Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain, Sand Mountain, Raccoon Mountain, the Cumberland Plateau, the creeks, Chattanooga Creek, Lookout Creek, and many, many others. Military campaigns are fought out on a canvas of terrain, making each one different. And successful commanders have to understand the particular ground that they will be contending for. So keep the terrain in mind. The second theme, people make war, not machines, and particularly senior leaders and their varied personalities have a lot to do with how campaigns result or how they end up. Some senior leaders are true leaders. Other senior leaders are there only because of either political connections or luck or favorable circumstances, but they don't know how to motivate thousands of troops. Some senior leaders don't know how to get along with their peers, their subordinates, and their seniors. Because after all, they're not cardboard cutouts. We might think of them that way as we read about them. They were real, living, flesh and blood people. And we all have our likes and dislikes, and the people we can get along with and the people we can't. And in the case of senior generals, That makes a lot of difference. Today in our professional forces, we believe we can overcome this. It's not a variable anymore. But having worked for the U.S. Army and with its senior leaders for over 30 years, I can assure you that people haven't changed since the 19th century. They just cover it up a little better from the public. Think about the senior leader personality conflicts in this campaign. And the final theme is a thing that historians grapple with all the time. It may or may not be apparent to audiences who buy their books and read them or listen to them speak. But the question is, how do you reduce great events like campaigns that involve 120, 130,000 people to human scale? We like to draw big red and blue arrows on maps, but at the tip of all of those arrows are living, breathing human beings. They're somebody's sons, they're somebody's husbands. They all had families at one time, and if you read their letters, it's very difficult not to become involved with their stories. They're privates in the ranks, but that's what armies are made up of. Privates in the ranks. And our challenge as historians is not to forget and get lost in tactical detail. Not to forget that they're really human beings, and what happens to those people is a tragedy of enormous dimensions. How can we tell the story without telling the story of the man in the ranks? Think on that as we go forward. We have for you today 3 speakers of great note. We're going to begin with Peter Cozzens. Peter has had 2 distinguished careers and continues in both. He is a U.S. Foreign Service officer for the Department of State, having served abroad in a great many capacities in a great many places, many of them, I suspect, very unpleasant, but necessary for the good of the country. He also has a distinguished career as a historian of the Civil War and the American Indian Wars. He's the author of 16 books, most notably for us today, This Terrible Sound, The Battle of Chickamauga, and the second, The Shipwreck of Their Hopes, The Battles for Chattanooga. He will briefly talk to us today about the question, did Braxton Bragg stand a chance at Chattanooga? Peter?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be back in Chattanooga. In fact, I'm not just saying this to be, or try to be ingratiating, but one of the reasons why I wrote my book on Chattanooga after the Chickamauga book was not because it was simply a logical sequence, but also because I wanted an excuse to come back to Chattanooga several times. Braxton Bragg, that tormented and tortured soul whose peculiar fortune it was to command the Army of Tennessee for nearly 2.5 tragic years. In all my years of researching and writing about the campaigns of the Western Theater, I have yet to find anyone who spoke well of him without significant reservations and qualifications. Considering what I was going to say in my brief remarks today, I had intended to join the chorus and recite the long litany of Bragg's errors during the Chattanooga campaign. Then, about 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon, I took a step back, tore up that talk, and just asked myself, what must it have been like to have been a Confederate soldier during the Chattanooga campaign? The short answer is that it was arguably the most miserable experience the men of the Army of Tennessee endured during the entire Civil War. To begin with, They were hungry, even by Southern Army standards. Much is made in writing about Chattanooga of the near starvation of the Union troops before the so-called Cracker Line was opened in late October 1863. But what is generally forgotten is that their opponents were as hungry, if not more so. Southern soldiers were used to food wanting in both quantity and quality, it goes without saying. They seldom mentioned it in letters or diaries, except in a sort of manly jest. But in writing of Chattanooga, they complained bitterly. Let's listen to what good-natured, normally optimistic Tennessee Private Sam Watkins had to say. Quote, "Never in all my life do I remember experiencing so much oppression and humiliation. The soldiers were starved and almost naked, and covered with all sorts of lice and campage and filth and dirt. The men looked sick, hollow-eyed and heartbroken, living principally upon parched corn, which had been picked out of the mud and dirt under the feet of officers' horses. We thought of nothing but starvation." That might have been a bit of hyperbole. And it's not entirely true. They had other grave preoccupations beside hunger. General Bragg spent the first weeks after Chickamauga, as Glenn has alluded to, sparring with and sacking commanders when he could. The deleterious effect of this on the Army, of this unseemly infighting, was not lost on the soldiers. A young Tennessee lieutenant summed up the feeling of the rank and file when he said, rather succinctly, "Everyone here curses that imbecile Bragg." Knowing that your generals loathed and distrusted one another, you can imagine did not inspire confidence among the Confederate soldiers in their leadership, which of course is a critical component to success in any battle. So besides being hungry, poorly clothed, and angry at their commanding general, the men were confused and anxious. As part of his vendetta against his senior leadership, Bragg had dismembered divisions and brigades to rob his opponents of their power blocks, particularly Ben Cheatham's Tennessee division. Spread the troops out among other divisions. And the result was, as soldiers who had fought and died together for 2 years, suddenly finding themselves in unfamiliar surroundings, under unfamiliar commanders, with unfamiliar units, on the eve of a major battle. We're talking less than a month before a major battle. So, with all these concerns and problems, what did the Confederate soldiers do? They deserted in droves. In October 1863 alone, the official number of desertions was 2,149, which was probably an undercount. And welcoming deserters into their lines was really a great morale boost, as you can imagine, for the Union troops. Let's jump ahead a little bit. Let's imagine you're a Confederate soldier. With all these concerns in mind, all these worries, imagine you're a Confederate soldier on Missionary Ridge on the eve of the battle. For nearly 2 months, you've been watching the Federals build up while your generals did nothing. No reinforcements, only detachments. No digging in, nothing. You're sitting there with this great panorama view of the city, Lookout Mountain, watching this enormous Federal buildup. And then, on November 23rd, General Bragg wakes up to the possibility that the Federals might actually attack Missionary Ridge. Go figure. So, you labor all night long in a frenzy to dig rifle pits and lay out artillery positions along Missionary Ridge that should have been done weeks earlier. You have very few tools to dig with. Colonel Arthur Manigault said that he had only 4 axes in his entire brigade. Your positions are placed on the highest points of Missionary Ridge, the so-called topographical crest, rather than the military forward crest, which will leave you a very nicely silhouetted target for the Yankees. Half of your fellow soldiers are ordered to hold rifle pits on the flat, on the plain below the ridge, at least 400, sometimes 500-600 yards away from you. Half of you were on the ridge, half of you were down on rifle pits below the ridge. The unfortunate soldiers down on the flat had orders to fire one volley when the Yankees came within 200 yards, and then basically run like hell up the ridge right into your rifle sights. Your own line on top of the ridge is thin. There are between 3 and 10 feet between you and the next man. Now it's the afternoon of November 25th, and 23,000 Union troops are sweeping toward Missionary Ridge. They overwhelm your comrades in the rifle pits on the plain about 300 feet below. These men struggle frantically to the safety of the crest. In some cases, as they're struggling up the crest toward you, the Yankees are only 50 yards behind them. Your comrades block your field of fire and cause you to overshoot the enemy. Now, even if you're fortunate enough to have no frightened fellow Southerners in front of you, a heavy blanket of gun smoke quickly settles into the ravines up which the Yankees are scratching and scrambling. Even if you can see the Yankees, you're reluctant to take careful aim, not only because of your comrades in front of you, because also your rifle pits are only waist high, which makes you in some ways an easier target for the Yankees than they are for you. Your comrades who race to the ridge shove past you. They're retching, they're stumbling. Many are carried off the field on stretchers because they're so sick they can't stand up. Your artillery support is of no use at all. Most of the batteries were located too far forward, and they can't depress their cannon tubes enough to engage the Yankees as they climb up the ridge. So you have exasperated artillerymen hurling lighted shells down the slope, and that is your artillery support. So it should come as no surprise that when the Confederate defenses unraveled on top of Missionary Ridge, there occurred the only instance I know of in which an enlisted man actually struck the commanding general of an army. General Bragg was sitting astride his horse near Army headquarters, waving a large flag and imploring his men to hold their ground. Now, according to campfire stories, he dismounted and walked among them, pleading for them to rally. But Braxton Bragg, of course, was no Napoleon, and his men were no old guard. One burly private heard Bragg's pleadings. He threw his rifle down and walked up to the general from behind. Grabbing Bragg by the waist, he spun the haggard general around, yelled in his face, "General, here's a mule for you," and then calmly went on his way. If you believed in omens, you probably would have expected the disaster in Missionary Ridge. At midnight, before the day of the battle, the clouds that had hidden the fighting on Lookout Mountain from view finally parted. It was a brilliant night. The moon was full. Its beams glittered on the icy rocks and cast weird shadows in the deep ravines of Missionary Ridge. Then suddenly, the sky turned pitch black. The moon had slipped into a total eclipse. To many Confederates who rode to the battle, the eclipse was a divine portent of immutable disaster. Nearly every soldier was gripped with a strange ennui, which the eclipse rendered even more sinister. I'd like to close with the words of one Confederate soldier who movingly summed up the situation facing the Army of Tennessee as dawn broke on November 25th. Speaking of his fellow soldiers, he said, quote, "Their minds were filled with doubt and their hearts burdened with misgivings. They had seen nothing but blunders and defeats and expected nothing less today. They knew they would fight only with the strength left from the shipwreck of their hopes, that they were standing on the embers of their ruined edifice. And with this knowledge, The eclipse produced an effect that was unaccountable were it not for the loss of Lookout Mountain. They discussed the situation, the loss of Lookout Mountain, the foothold the enemy had obtained on our right, that of General Hooker to follow from Lookout Mountain and envelop our left in the morning, with no force to stop him. Of the opportunity thrown away to capture Chattanooga and destroy the Federal Army, and the infatuation that determined a general engagement with the risk of ruin to our Army. They were in a poor state of mind to loan any confidence to General Bragg. He had expressed a want of confidence in the Army, and they returned the want of it in him with interest. Thank you very much.